Welcome to the Quark and Roll podcast. I am your host, Kwok Pui Lan. Today, my guest is Dr. Carlos Mendoza-Álvarez, who used to be a professor at Boston College in United States. Right now, he is living in Mexico City as a street theologian. So I'm going to ask him to explain to us what is a street theologian. Welcome, Carlos.
Thank you so much, Lan, for inviting me to this podcast. I'm very happy, excited to connect with you and your audience from Mexico City, when I'm located since last summer. I've been teaching for 30 years in Mexico City, in Brazil, in Switzerland, and then the 5 last years in Boston College. So for 30 years, I've been involved with students, scholars, trying to create together a theological reflection. My field is fundamental theology or philosophical theology, which represents a kind of permanent dialogue and discussion between faith and reason. And my focus has been particularly the subjectivity in modern times, how modern subjectivities are called by the divine revelation to be part of this process of redemption. So I've been exploring all this for 30 years and more, and particularly trying to connect the Latin American theology, particularly liberation theology, to European phenomenology, continental phenomenology, both trying to understand why modern subjectivities have been shaping their own idea of transcendence, of redemption in different ways. So that's why, after 30 years as a formal theologian, now I call myself a street theologian because I'm retired and I want to go back to the street with the people, particularly following the decolonial lens. It's important to listen to the peripheries, connecting with the peripheries, the people in the peripheries of any kind of hegemonic systemic violence. So that's why I call myself a street theologian. I think it's much better to only call myself a former professor because I continue doing theology in a different way. And my interlocutors are, of course, the great authors and new authors, books and bibliography, but social movements for me have become a more important interlocutor now because their wisdom is absolutely important. When I talk about social movements, I'm thinking about, for instance, immigrants, women, indigenous communities, or queer communities. And in my context in Mexico, the families of missing persons, which represent a very important question, in particular for theology and philosophy. In my country, 150,000 missing persons in the last 20 years, which represents like a war. So how can we talk about God's redemption in this context and listening to them, to the families of the missing persons, the wisdom they have, for me, is the main source now to understand better theology. And we will talk later about, in my book on the resurrection, I try to connect the experience of mourning of that people, the families of missing persons, to the Jesuanic community, also processing the mourning of Jesus' death. So that's why I call myself a street theologian.
I have always admired your work, Carlos, because repeatedly you call our attention to those who are really at the margin, those who are suffering from different kinds of oppression and lifting up their voices in your theological and philosophical reflections. I want to ask, have you done theology always with that close attention to the suffering people? Can you share a little bit about your formation, especially you are a member of the Dominican Order?
I was thinking about that, Wilan. Thank you for this question, because that reminds me of the process that I've been exploring for now 45 years as a Dominican, a member of the Dominican Order or the Order of Preachers. When I was a novice, our novice master, he used to say, we need to connect the contemplation of the incarnate word, logos, to the vulnerable people. Since the beginning of my novitiate, my religious formation, I was trained in this kind of contemplation contemplating God's mystery, of course, in prayer, in liturgical celebrations, but especially in the bodies, minds, stories of the vulnerable people. In my context, in my country, particularly the indigenous communities. So 1 month during our novitiate, whole year as a novitiate, we spent in Chiapas, southern Mexico, visiting the indigenous communities as novices, together with our master. So for me, that was an important revelation about my own identity as a human being, as a Mexican citizen, and as a Dominican, a young Dominican, because I was for the first time crossing the abyssal line of those who are the most vulnerable in my country, indigenous communities. 10% of indigenous people, they are Mexicans. And for us, the indigenous are like from other world. My first contact with them was very important because I discovered the radicality of their life, their wisdom, their way of organizing themselves, worshiping God, also taking care of each other. And so that's why, for me, this revelation, visiting the communities in southern Mexico, was like the starting point of this process of getting closer and closer to different kinds of people in the peripheries.
Thank you very much for sharing your formation process. Nowadays, many people are very distressed because of what is happening in the world. You have written this book about resurrection as Messianic Anticipation, again, lifting up the voices of the survivors of various oppressions. Can you share your thoughts about resurrection?
When I was reading many years ago Leonardo Boff's theology about ecclesiology, about the church, and then the new approach of ecology, in one of the sentences, Leonardo Boff said, "The resurrection is an insurrection." And he continued talking about how the resurrection is a process of life against death. And that was like the first insight that I got about the insurrection as an insurrection. Of course, in modern languages, insurrection is like a revolt against a political authority or something like that. But insurgere in Latin means something different. Insurgere means something emerging from the deep aspect of our lives, the deep dimension of human condition. So that's why insurrection is a very powerful word in Spanish, at least. It's not only related to a political struggle. It's about something raising from the bottom of our hearts, our lives. So I got that idea from Leonardo Boff, and then I said, I need to explore seriously what it means, this process of resurrection as insurrection. And that's why I was going back to different modern theologians, trying to talk about the resurrection in terms of reshaping human condition, and the eschatological idea of prolepsis, anticipation, is an eschatological idea, you remember, and the audience probably too. Berg was one of the most important theologians in modern times, talking about this eschatological category of anticipation, messianic anticipation, the promises of God, the kingdom of God, and then the final redemption of the whole creation is in some way related to here and now. So eschatology is not only about the last days after death, but is also in some way affecting every moment now. And that's why this idea of prolepsis or messianic anticipation came into my mind, saying this is the key category to understand the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, of course, but every righteous of the nations and every creature and human being called by God to go beyond death. So that's why, for me, this was an important insight about how to understand resurrection in a more historical way, following liberation theology process, but at the same time in a more phenomenological way, I would say. Is something affecting us in the deeper dimension of our lives. So it's an anticipation of the eternal life, of the plenitude of being that God is offering to us. And that's why my book on the resurrection is precisely entitled The Resurrection as Messianic Anticipation. And the role of survivors is absolutely crucial. Because of the survivors that we can understand and get the insight about how the survivors are reshaping the process of mourning the loss of their beloved. Of course, in my first experience, the families of the missing persons in my country were deeply, immediately connected to Jesus's community and how they processed the loss of their master, how the Jesuanic community after the crucifixion was reshaping their own experience of loss. Their master was assassinated, was executed by the Roman Empire with the complicity of some authorities in the Temple of Jerusalem. But how the community reshaped this experience of loss in order to going back to their experience. That's why memory is absolutely important. Then telling the story of their master too, and continuing performing the same symbols of life that Jesus performed while he was in Galilee. That's why the sacramentality of this first community of Christians, and then the symbols they also created, like the Eucharistic symbol, they are like at the core of the Messianic community of Jesus of Nazareth, and is the core of Christian faith, in my understanding. But it's not only about the past, Jesus' community. This is about here and now. Every community facing death, as survivors, they're called and supported by God in order to reshape that process of loss and mourning into a process of life and hope. And I've been like testing in so different moments the power of this kind of insight, the resurrection as Messianic anticipation.
This is so beautiful. I want to probe a little bit more about the methodology, theological method, because obviously you are very familiar with the colonial thinking, talking about border knowledge. Just now, you were in dialogue with, on the one hand, those theologians such as Leonardo Boff and Pannenberg, and on the other hand, you bring them into conversation with the stories and memories of the victims and those who are oppressed. Would you think that it is important that we open our theological imagination to many places to seek wisdom? Because some of my students said, why do we need to continue to read the dead or living white man's stuff? Why can't we just do theology from our context, listening to people's stories? How would you respond?
I think your students are very smart people because they have a kind of a suspicion about the colonial process that we continue many times improving while we're doing theology. We need to decolonize theology, opening the sources of our reflection to other traditions, other epistemologies, other ways of thinking, other wisdoms. And I think they're right. But at the same time, we belong to a Western tradition rooted in Western rationalities. Of course, we need to go beyond this like first reception of Christianity in this Western rationality. Karl Rahner used to say that Christianity has been discussing for 2 millennia with Greek and Roman rationality, Western rationalities. But the third millennium of Christianity, Rahner used to say, is called to discuss and to integrate a deep conversation with Hinduism, for instance, which represents a very different rationality, and to create a new synthesis of what Christianity is about. So the story is not closed, it's not over. The history of Christianity continues, a call to continue reflecting on the mystery of redemption in different contexts, societies, and then in different cultures. That's why, because we Western people who are being colonized by Western churches, we are in some way historically related to this kind of framework. And that's why it's important to get connected to those authors. Of course, the fathers of the church, and then St. Augustine, and then the modern medieval and modern authors, but it's not enough. And that's why I think the colonial thinking is trying to say, okay, what Christian authors try to say in their grammar, with their language at that time, how other cultures have been also getting the insight about the mysterious God. And that's why decolonial theology now is exploring this kind of ecology of knowledge, trying to balance this asymmetrical relationship between Western Christianity and then the indigenous communities or other non-Christian rationalities. But this is a task that the following generations will be facing in some way. So I'm very optimistic about the horizon. We're moving towards this new understanding of what Christianity is about. But I think we need to be also rigorous in the methodology, talking about the sources we have. Of course, the Bible is the first source that we have, and we need to revisit the Bible all the time. It's a never-ending process with new tools, the historical Jesus, and then new tools about the contextual theologies and so on, revisiting the Bible. Or now the Palestinian theologians who are trying to decolonize the Bible also, trying to read the Bible not only using Western lens, but also trying to understand what's the role of other nations, not from the Israel descendants, but other nations who are part of the history of revelation in the Bible. So that's why I think the Bible is there. Our tradition of 2,000 years about what theology is about, but now we need to take really into account all the rationalities, all the epistemologies talking about the mystery of God. That's why, for instance, in Latin America, what we call Theologia India or indigenous theology is trying to explore this. They have been exploring this for half a century, trying to understand the Bible is our first testament and then the Gospels. But we had also our Old Testament, I say, the Maya communities, the sacred books of the Maya people. Then they are also a source of revelation, of understanding God's mystery, and then preparing to welcome God's mystery in Jesus Christ. For instance, India, indigenous theology, is exploring this in a very creative way. There are many authors, Roberto Tomicha in Bolivia. There are women also working on this, Tina Rivera in Guatemala, different indigenous communities and authors who are trying to engage this conversation between the Western theology and then their indigenous background. And I think we need to listen carefully to them too.
Yes, exactly. I want to ask, given that you are in Mexico City, there has been growing tension between United States and Mexico. And just last week, the U.S. bombed a boat from Venezuela. Can you share about people's reaction to the United States as it is asserting all different kinds of tariffs and also coercions in other countries?
There's a long history about the relationship between the United States and Latin America and the Caribbean, 250 years. The Messianic understanding of colonization that the United States has developed for 250 years still is there. It's not new. This kind of imperial way of thinking about how to colonize the lands in the southern border. For many American citizens and governments, the Latin American and Caribbean countries were like the backyard of their country. This has a long story, this kind of asymmetrical relationship between the two parts of the continent. But in the last years, particularly during this new administration, I think there have been more aggressive policy against the countries who are perceived like a threat for the Western democracies and the free world. And that's why some particular countries are targeted, like Venezuela, of course, but also some others, Brazil in some way, by now Lula, and trying to stop like this kind of process of like a new democracy. But of course, there are many issues about drug traffic and how many governments are involved in this. It's not only about the Latin American governments, Russia, China, even the US institutions. They are in some way involved by what we call transnational criminality. And there are some philosophers and political scientists like Achille Bembe in Cameroon and South Africa talking about the necro power. It's a new form of state which is infiltrated or polluted by criminal mafias controlled by all over the world. It's not only an issue of the Latin American corrupted countries or governments. It's not only about the African democracy who have failed. It's a transnational problem, a transnational issue. And that's why I think what's seen from Mexico, from this perspective, what's going on today in this new geopolitics between the United States, the European Union, and then the Western world, including Latin America and the Caribbean, and then Asia, China, particularly India, controlling that region of the planet. Now they are looking for, in my opinion, this kind of new sharing of the planet and following both sides the same logic, what is called by some experts like extractivist capitalism, because it's a new way of economy, but also leading and controlling ideologies and policy, political life in different countries. The perception in Mexico about we are neighbors with the Americans. The new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, she is a Jew layperson. She's not a practitioner of the Jewish tradition, but she's a Jew and a scientist who has been trying to stop, to control this kind of polarization. She never replied in the same way to Donald Trump's aggressive comments about Mexicans, about the government, etc. So she's trying to negotiate in a different way with the US administration about economy, about migration, about climate change, etc. And trying to reshape also our own understanding of what democracy is about. We are facing now in Mexico a very particular moment because it's for the first time in history that a leftist party is running the country. It's the second term of a presidency coming from the leftist party. But they have been supporting, for instance, economy. 20% of Mexicans left poverty, which is very important in 10 years. But it's not enough because the asymmetry of wealthness in the country is still there. The corruption of the government, of different companies, still there. And the criminal mafias, they are controlling a lot of territories in Mexico. They're trafficking so many things. The criminal mafias, they're not only trafficking drugs, as it used to be in the past. They're trafficking guns, money, human organs, migrants. And what is going on today is like this kind of devastation produced by the criminal mafias in the local communities. And so that's why probably the main challenge for Mexican society is trying to engage a healing process as a community, as a country, in order to reshape our way of living, our economy, and then trying to negotiate differently with the United States administration, because our stories and histories are so entangled each other. For centuries, we have been crossing the borders, we Mexicans and the US people too, and then commodities and culture and even religion. How many Christians from Latin America are now renewing American churches? So it's an important partner. We are partners. And that's probably something that is not like the main idea of the new administration.
What are your hopes for global movements of resistance? And what will your advice be as a long-term scholar and activist to pass on to the next generation?
Oh, Puilan, what a question. My hope is that the survivors, they have enough strength and wisdom to help all of us to re-exist. I think that's why we need to listen carefully to the survivors. They're not only victims of climate change, of poverty, of criminal mafias, of patriarchy, homophobia, so many exclusions. Those victims, they have a particular wisdom and they have a particular strength because they have been resisting to different kinds of violence. And that's why we need to take care of them, of course, to accompany them, to support them, but also to learn from them, their wisdom. And if we do, we will be able to create different kind of communal bonds among us in our local places. Sometimes we read news in different newspapers and digital media, and it's very depressive. Of course, we don't want to listen anymore about Gaza or about Ukraine or about Congo, but we need to open our minds, our hearts, also to the wisdom of those people. And that's why I would suggest for my students, I used to do that when I was in Boston or before in Mexico City or Brazil. Let's try to do theology from the margins, because Jesus's community was born in that way, the church. So it's as a community of redeemers, a community of survivors, a community of people who have been saying, this is not our last destiny. Death is not our last destiny. God's will, God's love is moving us towards different path, different horizon, which is the plenitude of life. But it's coming only in a very small way as anticipation. Once again, it's like a sparkles of something new. It's some lights that in the midst of horror, of obscurity, of darkness, then when a survivor creates something new, is giving us something new to all human beings. That's why I like very much that Hebrew expression of the tzaddikim, the righteous of the nations, the 36 righteous people in every generation who anonymously, they are following deeply in their hearts the rule of love. And that's why they in some way allow us to stand up together. And it's because of these survivors that I think we can say we have hope. We are open to new life.
Thank you very much for joining the podcast and for this reminder of hope in all of us. And if you like this episode, please comment and subscribe. I will see you in the next episode.